Welcome to another episode of Top Lines and Tales. This week we discuss yet another American legendary cattleman, someone who has made his mark in history in the Hereford cattle breed the world over, Glenn Klippenstein from Glenkirk Farms in Missouri. I'm once again delighted to have on the program Dr. Bob Hoke, and we also have some input from a previous guest, Bill Hodge. Bob, welcome back.
Thank you.
Bob, Glenn Klippenstein, a man you know pretty well, I think.
Oh yeah, he was a Penn State grad like myself, and gosh, he was a force in the industry. I mean, you kind of name any aspect of the industry from service to breeding cattle, multiple breeds. I mean, he kind of did it all. Service in the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the checkoff, all kinds of service, and speaking and judging. Boy, he was just a force.
He certainly fits into our legendary Cattlemen series, and although associated mainly with the polled Hereford breed, he bred all sorts of things, didn't he? He had an interesting career, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he bred a horned Hereford, so he was kind of agnostic as to whether they were horned or polled, which was just a terrible thing amongst most people. I mean, it was horned or polled I mean, you didn't cross lines, and he didn't really care. But he was into Simmentals and Chianinas and Angus for different times, and made an impact on all of them. He was a great breeder.
He started his studies in Pennsylvania State University under the famous Herman Purdy, who we've talked about before. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that is right. I mean, he lived out at the barns, and he was one of the barn boys, and I mean, he worked his way through college. I mean, at the barns, and of course, tuition was a lot cheaper back then. But he got quite an education under Professor Purdy, and I mean, he worked with the showstring, which was quite large at that time, and I mean, he really got a full breadth of education under Professor Purdy.
And he got, I think, to prepare and help fit the 1956 famous Chicago champion steer.
Yeah, Troubadour. And Troubadour was one of his jobs was he had Troubadour on two nurse cows. So he had to nurse Troubadour twice a day. I mean, this was up to the show. And I guess sometimes Troubadour was more interested in nursing than others. So sometimes he was there for quite a while trying to get a Troubadour to nurse these two cows. But I mean, he helped fit out the rail car and went to Chicago with the steer. And they actually had Grand and Reserve champion steers, which is really kind of unheard of. Sure. But then they fit out Troubadour afterwards, and he took a tour of the Eastern United States. So he was a very famous steer. And Glenn certainly has his part in preparing with that steer.
Wow, and he certainly is a famous steer, you're right. And Herman Purdy had a lot of respect for Glenn, I can see, and he even took him to meet Eisenhower, is that right?
Yeah, he took him and another student because he of course, was a consultant for Gettysburg Farm, President Eisenhower's farm, Angus Farm, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where the famous Civil War battle occurred. And he took two other students, and Glenn, I guess they had two students sat there and listened to them talk for 3 hours. And they talked about cattle, they talked about battles, they talked about the Civil War. And he said it was a life-changing experience. And so it was really a big thing for him and really gave him a lot of gravitas about, boy, if I can sit here and listen to the President of the United States, maybe I can go somewhere. It was a big deal.
Sure, it was. And in his senior year, Purdy asked Glenn to assist with coaching the judging team. Is that right? So,
yeah, and I think he counts that as maybe his proudest moment to have Professor Purdy ask him to help out with the judging team. And really how that came about is when Professor Purdy went over to Perth to judge the show. And he needed somebody to fill in for him. So he asked Glenn to fill in for him, help carry the team while he was away. So, yeah, he really thought a lot of that. And he was so honored to have Professor Purdy ask him to do that.
Well, he's done all this, and this is him just still at university. He certainly made a good start to his life, didn't he?
He won every award you could get at the college, Ag Man of the Year, Ag Student. I mean, you name it, he won every award you could get. And I mean, he was ready to chew nails when he got out of there because he had such an education and he was so pumped up, and he had a lot of opportunities to go about anywhere he wanted to manage herds, including President Eisenhower's. But he struck out on his own.
That's right. He went out and rented a farm himself, pretty much after he graduated.
Yeah, and boy, that's a bold move. For a student without really any money, and I mean, he was scrambling. He was, he would buy heifer calves and raise them as dairy replacements. He would sell freezer beef. He sold hay to horse owners. I mean, he scrambled every which way to make money as he built a polled Hereford herd that was really quite good. But I mean, he was a worker.
Certainly sounds like it. And again, for our younger listeners on here, and we're going to do a piece on the younger generation in a while. But for a lot of the youngsters, when you really want to make it in life, then you find a way to make it somehow. And good for him.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it really was amazing. I mean, he turned down the plum jobs of the plum jobs to go on his own. Boy, that takes a lot of gumption.
It takes a lot of guts too. You're right. And straight away with the herd that he started, he was on the lookout for bigger, heavier muscle cattle. And this is the early '60s, right?
Yeah, he was always about lean meat yield. He was never on the belt buckle bandwagon, just like Mr. Lingle. He was on a different path. He saw a different vision for the industry, and so he was going for some bigger, faster growing, heavier muscle cattle, especially leaner.
Bill, if I can bring you in there, you had the opportunity to meet him, right? Is that right, when he was still at Penn State?
It was shortly after that. I was a 4-H kid that was showing horned Hereford cattle, and I met him for the first time at the State Fair of Virginia. And he was there with, I think it was his brother maybe, and they had a string of Hereford cattle. This was while he was still living in Pennsylvania prior to moving to Missouri. But the thing that struck me was he would always go out of his way to help someone like myself. I think I was 11, 12 years old, something like that. And here was a guy that just busy as can be, but yet he give you the time of day and spend time with you. And it really made a lasting impression on a young kid. I remember him well.
That's a great measure of a man that has time to do that. And again, we talk about some of these legendary cattlemen, as which there has been a series of now. And yes, a lot of them, they do like to get out and put some of their knowledge back into the younger generation. Would that be right, Bob?
Oh, I mean, he was a mentor to so many youth and young cattle producers of every kind. And he always held judging team workouts, prior to contests that were held in his area, and they were legendary because he not only would have a great contest, he would at the end would give a fire up speech to end all fire up speeches. I mean, he'd have everybody ready to go, and I mean, it was just one of the great events of the season. Every team went to his workouts, and he hired a lot of young people. He got a lot of interns. He was really into mentoring youth.
A wonderful thing to hear, and there are a lot of people still within the breed in your side of the water and ours that still will put their best into helping the youngsters. That's great to hear. And then going back to Glenn, from the farm that he rented, he managed to buy a farm in partnership with a chap called Kirk Pendleton in 1966, I think. And between them, they had a herd of 100 polled Herefords, maybe polled and horned Herefords, and they started the famous Glen Kirk Farms, and I guess he'd saved his pennies to get to buy that.
Well, I mean, Kirk had some money, and Glenn had the cattle and the know-how, but I mean, after that initial investment, I mean, that farm ran as a business. I mean, it was not a subsidized business at all, but I mean, it was a good marriage at the beginning. I mean, they picked out in the whole United States where they thought it was best to sell bulls. And I mean, they pinpointed where it was closest to where they thought the breed associations were. So that's where they located it. I mean, it was an open map, and they had quite an operation going.
Excuse my ignorance, where was that?
That was near Kansas City, north of Kansas City, in Maysville, Missouri. And in Kansas City, where most of the breed associations were located at the time, they thought it was a great place to sell bulls. I mean, it was just, they really located it where they thought was the future of the beef industry. That's where they located the operation.
It was just only a few years later that they went on and won Grand Champion Hereford at the National Polled Hereford Show in Houston, judged by Harlan Ritchie, among others. And he's a man we're going to talk about in a another episode. But Glenn went on to win that 19 times in all, and 12 times in 13 years, I think, from 71 to 84. I mean, that's some achievement.
Yeah, I mean, it's a phenomenal achievement. And I'll put two things in perspective here. First, Can-Am Investor was a champion in 1969 in February of that year. And that was the year of the type change of when Herman Purdy did it in Argentina, and when the Big Northern with the Angus Bull was picked at the International, and Conoco, the steer, was picked by Dr. Good at the International. So he led off the year of the type change with Can-Am Investor. So it was a big, big event. I mean, it took a lot of notice. And then the other thing, I mean, he did use the show ring to promote his program very well. And I'd like to tell you one quick story. I mean, he was quite a showman. And I was there one time in the very early 80s, and he had the national champion GK Excitement 4. And we were doing a tour, and he had us all at the bottom of a hill, small hill, and there was some brush on top. He had us all staged, this group, and out of the brush came GK Excitement 4 on a trot, and him behind him. And I mean, it just made an impression. She was on top of this hill. She was a big, stout female, and he told us all. He said, "You know what I like about her? She's kind of feminine and prissy, but when she walks through the jungle, she'll knock down some trees." And so that always stuck with me, and he always had to say for a lot of things.
He sounds like a great showman, and as a lot of these great breeders are, as you said, use the show ring to their advantage, and it's not just about winning prizes; it's about using it as a marketing tool. You mentioned briefly, Bob, that the bull, influential bull, I would say, Big Northern. He was Canadian, is that right? Tell me a bit more about him.
Well, Can-Am Investor and Big Northern were both Canadian, and he sourced a lot of his genetics out of Canada, as did the United Kingdom. When the type switched, a lot of the Canadian cattle were just bigger and better.
Would I be right in saying that Glenn was actually born in Canada? Did I see someone?
He was. He moved fairly young because his parents really valued education. So they wanted to have a Christian education. So they moved him to Pennsylvania from a homestead in the prairie of Canada. So it was quite a change, that's for dang sure. But he did have some connections up there, and I mean, he would go on the road. I mean, if he thought there was someplace he could find some cattle that would suit his needs, and I mean, he made a lot of friends up in Canada, and Don Mitchell at Klondike Farms, they became very close, and yeah, they brought a lot of great cattle down, and Big Northern, boy, he was a sire of sires. I mean, he was a horn bull, but I mean, he kind of cleaned up all over. You know, National Western Stock Show, I think in '76, he sold a bull out of him for $100,000, and you put that in today's money, that's close to $450,000. I mean, he was a big time sire.
So certainly Glenkirk Farms became a super force within the breed, within all breeds. And did I see that GK had sold something like 14,000 bulls in 28 years? That's a hell of a number. And that 50% of the Hereford breeding in the US go back to his genetics, and equally so in Argentina and South Africa. This guy really did make a mark.
Oh, I mean, tremendous. And I mean, he sold a lot of cattle. He was a good salesman. I mean, he was selling the real thing. And I think he had $42 million in sales, which is a phenomenal amount. But he was running a big business, too, and with a lot of breeds and a lot of things going. But, yeah, internationally, I mean, he was all over the world. And, he was quite a force, like I said earlier.
When Glenkirk was at its peak during the late 70s, mid 80s, and the world suffered a terrible inflation and unprecedented interest rates and low agricultural commodity prices, but must have been tough times, but he made it work for him.
Well, he did make it work, but I'll tell you what, you know, a lot of people thought Glenkirk was a money operation. I mean, it was run on notes. I mean, it was run on loans, just like every other production startup operation. And for a while there, I mean, we were tucking up close to 20% interest. It was tough. And it was, and when commodity prices were low, and gosh, it was really tough. And then, I mean, for a few years there, I was told by his son that he figured he had to work through August before he could pay down what was his loans and his interest before he could start paying the what it cost to run the operation and everything else. So I mean, it was a huge burden. It was a huge burden for all of agriculture. Gosh, it was a tough time. But he made it work. That's phenomenal, Eddie. I mean, he made it work.
And the bigger business you get, of course, the harder those things hit. And like all great breeders, Glenn Klippenstein was a prolific judge. And did he judge over 400 shows? Is that right?
Yeah, that's the estimate. I mean, he judged them all over the world. I mean, from Zimbabwe to South Africa and all through South America, all over the United States. I mean, he was a very, very in-demand judge until he finally decided that things had gotten carried away about 86 or so. The frame race had just gotten carried away, and then he just stopped judging because he just no longer was where it was at in terms of that. And gosh, he was in demand for a speaker too, which you might have some interest in. I think he gave like 1,000 speaking engagements, and for a couple of years he was on the road most of the year. I mean, it was phenomenal, and I used him everywhere. If you wanted to close a program, I mean, he was the guy to close the program with. And when we just talked about those rough times in the 70s and 80s. I remember using him in a program in that time period. And he ran that operation lean in terms of machinery and stuff. I remember him telling our crowd that how he hated machinery. All you do is you buy it and it rusts and it depreciates. He's never seen a piece of it yet. Lay down and have another. So, I mean, he would make an impression. That's for darn sure. So if you wanted to close a program and get some people to do some stuff, he was your man.
Okay. He certainly was a force of personality, wasn't he? And he was asked to represent the industry at some pretty key times, wasn't he?
Well, he was the second person on our beef checkoff program, president of that, which is a controversial subject here. But I mean, he really got it on sound footing. And I mean, he got it so it was audited every year. And I mean, had some accountability. But I mean, with his force, they asked him to go out and represent the industry with like Walmart, which I think you have over in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Yeah. And yeah, at that time, they did not carry any perishable product. And that means they sold no beef. That was a big deal. I mean, they were one of the largest retailers in the United States as well as the world. And so he went through their CEO all the way up to Mr. Walton and convinced them to carry perishable products, which led them to carry beef eventually. And I mean, just think of the impact that had. And then he had some other successes, like he got McDonald's to do a $35 million campaign just to promote beef. And this is when beef per capita consumption was on just a downward spiral. He had one that was probably not his finest moment because he got McDonald's to have seaweed burgers that were kind of mixed with seaweed and to make it a more healthy option. And that one didn't work out so well, but I mean, he was doing anything to get per capita consumption back up and going. But I mean, they used him hard and he was always ready to serve.
He was certainly a marketeer as well, and also he went on to be chairman of the APHA, the American Polled Hereford Cattle Association, and he was responsible, I believe, or certainly involved in merging the horned and the polled Hereford breeds, and that's an interesting one in the UK. Or maybe that would have been a fairly tough deal as well.
Well, I mean, it was, and it didn't happen during his tenure, but he laid the foundation, and the first talks were laid during his period of time. And I mean, they did some strategic planning, and that came up in the strategic planning that, I mean, it was, these breed associations, the Herefords were going down at that time, and Angus was going up in terms of registration. So there's financial implications. And I mean, there was a lot of reasons to put them together. And again, he was agnostic. He had horned and polled, and I mean, he didn't care as long as they were good cattle. And so he saw that as a vision. And it was also during the period where they adopted EPDs. So I mean, he had a very, very substantial role with the American Polled Hereford Association.
I'll bring in Bill on that one there as well. What would you have to say about the merging of those two great phenomena?
Well, in my Hereford days, before I ventured to the Angus side, there was both of those American associations, the pole and the horns, were separate and very strong associations. I recall president of the American Junior Hereford Association in 1970, and there was really no love lost between the two associations. So for somebody to putting the two associations together, forming one to create more efficiencies in the system, that's quite an accomplishment for a man.
Can I tell you a quick story? I was on a panel with all the breed execs, and it was when Hop Dickinson was retiring, and Herefords had declined so drastically at that point, and the merger had occurred, and Hop was retiring. But at the beginning of the panel, we had a dairy buyout at one point to support dairy prices, and he got up and he said, I'm thinking of making a switch to the federal government because they're thinking of having a new dairy buyout program. And they saw that I was so successful at decreasing Hereford numbers that I might be the right man for the job, which was just hilarious at the time. For somebody to be that self-effacing was just wonderful.
Excellent. And as we mentioned, it wasn't just Herefords. He was a big name in the Angus cattle too, wasn't he? And he bred some top bulls. Didn't he own PS Power Play? I mean, he's one of the most famous Angus I know.
Yeah, it was with Penn State, and he was a Penn State graduate, and he got part of Power Play, and it was and he promoted the bull and was part of showing the bull, and really did a great job. But the sad thing again, he was running it as a business, and I mean it was like Mr. Lingle. He sold the bull to make payroll, unfortunately. Well, so he didn't really cash in totally because he had to sell it a little bit more prematurely. But that's part of running a business. It's just part of what you have to do.
At least he's got it in his history because, as we know, power play is in the history of a lot of Angus cattle to this day. Glenkirk's farms would have production sales, and they'll sell cattle all over the US and into South America. And there was a cow in South America bred by them called Miss America, and she had a huge status over there. Do you know about her?
Yeah, Miss America. I mean, she was one of the all-time high volume. I mean, just in terms of gross dollars of her production, she might have been one of the top cows in the world. I mean, anywhere. I mean, she made a phenomenal impact, and they didn't have much in her either. I mean, they didn't pay that much for her, but she had a huge impact.
We move on. We mentioned the various breeds. The Simmental herd Glenn started in 1971, and he bought 2 heifer calves again in Canada. And these were the first purebred Simmentals in the US. So this is a pioneer bringing the new Continentals into the US.
I think it was the first females, and I think there were some bulls certainly that had come over the border. I know there were some bulls, but these were 2 of the early females that came across, and he flushed them. And flushing had been done experimentally at universities, but there was a commercial outfit started flushing cows, and this is when you had to turn them up on their belly, on their back, and you put them under anesthesia and cut them. It was a big deal. Now, one of them worked, and he made a lot of money on that one flush. The other one they ruined. She just never would reproduce again. But he was always out there trying the newest technology, that's for sure.
So to be a pioneer in that was incredible. And ET now, of course, is the backbone of a lot of the pedigree breeding seed stocks the world over. And he went on, dispersed the Simmental herd in 1976, so after 6 years, by which time they had built up to 70 cows, and they averaged $4,400 in 1976. So that's not a bad return on 2 heifers.
Well, that was a great amount of money, and he actually has sold approximately that same amount up to Bar 5 in Canada. I mean, he had those full bloods, but he also bred a lot of Black Angus cattle to Simmental. So he had this Black Angus based Simmental, a lot of half bloods, some 3/4 bloods, and I mean they were really in demand. And I mean, there's kind of an interesting story there because I know this is blasphemy to the people in the UK, but for the breed to survive in the United States with certified Angus beef and the black-hided thing, they were basically dead. The spotted cattle, they were on the no-buy list. I mean, you just couldn't sell them anymore. And so they had to turn black and polled.
Let me just elaborate that to clear that up for our UK listeners. I think a lot of them will know that you're right. The cattle had to be black to qualify for the certified Angus scheme. So you're right. Most of the breeds in the US turned black very quickly.
Oh, they did. I mean, really quickly, and that made them uniform as feeder cattle. But Dave Nichols, who's a friend of mine, and another Mr. Taylor were the two pioneers of black polled cattle. And Dave wanted to get a jump on the black polled thing, so he bought 83 head. With the only criteria is they have a black factor. Some of them were diluters. They'd be polled, and they have an average weaning ratio of 105 and not missed a calf. And lo and behold, when he got them back and got the registration papers, a whole bunch of them were Glenn's cattle. So
Really?
I mean, they made one big circle, but I mean, Glenn had a big impact as it turned out.
He put the backbone in the black polled Simmental cattle of today. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean it was no one knew at the time. And I'm not even sure whether he knew at the time, but I mean it was a big deal.
And then we go on to the other breed that he kept was the import of Chianina cattle, and that was suggested to him, I think, by Harlan Ritchie.
Yeah, Harlan, did studies over in Europe of cattle breeds, and he was so excited about the Chianina cattle, and Glenn had gone over to purchase Simmentals, and he made a trip down to Italy to check out the Chianinas, and he thought they had value in terms of lean yield and some factors, and of course frame was a factor at that time. So he got into the Chianina business, and he did well with it. He had a very popular sire, and I mean he got along with it. Some of his cowboys didn't like the disposition that much, and some of them did have disposition problems, but he did well, and he got out of them at the right time, and he made a good amount of money on the cattle.
It's a breed that never really took off in the UK, but you're right, he did make them work for him. And I read that he bought 6 cows and he'd sold 2 of them for the cost of the whole 6 before he even got them out of quarantine back in the US. So,
I think it might have just been one actually, and I think he sold it for $40,000, and it was the one he least liked because it was a substitute because one didn't make health requirements, so they did a sub. And he did very well on that, and so he got along quite well. I mean, he knew how to market cattle.
Bill, bring you in. Have you had any dealings with Chianina breed of cattle?
I have. I'll never forget the first ones I saw were actually here in Georgia. An Angus herd had AI'd a group of cows to the I can't recall which bulls, but when we went to the pasture to see them, we got out of the truck. All the cows were grazing, and all the calves ran over the hill. So from that, I wasn't sure what to make of the situation. But then once we kind of figured out which ones were a little less on the high-headed side, then we ended up using a few of them in some commercial cattle, and we're actually selling them as 4-H club calves for a while. So yeah, I dabbled in the keys for a little bit.
All fairness to the breed, I actually for about 3 weeks every summer, end of the summer, I helped fit some Chianina cattle for some people, and actually the full bloods were really pretty easy to get along with in my experience. It was those darn percentage cattle, especially the half bloods. They were the spicier ones. But I always got along great with the full bloods.
From my experience with them, they could kick you from a hell of a range.
Well, I've gotten kicked in the chest. Those are the only times I've ever gotten kicked in the chest. But they had some good. I mean, we shouldn't cut on the breed because they really had some good, and they worked well in composites.
We're not saying that anything against Glenn getting rid of them, but he did cash the purebreds in after just 8 years. And again, he made another killing with these things. The herd sire you mentioned was called Hirohito, would I be right? And he was pretty famous and still is, I think. Is he not still high up there in the breed?
I'm not sure whether he's still high in the breed, but yeah, he was a really high impact bull at the time.
And Bob, were you involved in the Chianina, the breed society? Were you not?
I wasn't involved in the society, but I did help out with an operation that had Chianinas, kind of a lot of them, and I did that, and I always worked 3 weeks at the end of the season fitting them on the show road, and again they were an interesting breed to work with. I mean, they had some traits that you like to incorporate in a composite, But by themselves, they weren't the total package.
And let's move on with Glenn Klippenstein. Like James Lingle before him, it was all down to figures at the end of the day. He always had genetic improvement in mind, didn't he? When anything he went to, he understood the importance of documenting performance and figures, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he ran performance testing. He weighed all his cattle. He kept them in contemporary groups. And he had one of the largest, most extensive progeny testing programs in the world that I know of. I mean, he tested 75 sires, minimum of 20 head per sire, that he kept all the way from birth to carcass. And he measured all the traits. And he did that over many years in the Montana herd. So, I mean, he was totally committed to objectively getting these cattle. And he was such a pioneer in this. I would like to just read you a quick quote, because in 1959, he did his senior thesis on performance testing before it really was a thing. I mean, Mr. Lingle and Sal Forbes in Montana or Wyoming were doing it. But in his senior thesis in 1955, he quoted, Lord Kelvin once said, you're a British mathematician in UK, when you can measure what you are speaking about and explain it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot explain it in numbers, your knowledge is meager, unsatisfactory kind. I thought, boy, that's interesting to come up with that in 1959.
Yes, certainly. And on our side of the water, that wasn't really going on at that time. Although, having said that, my grandfather was in the chicken business and the fruit business, and he kept meticulous records. So maybe the pioneers understood that was what was required to take everything forward. But Glenn Klippenstein really was way in front of his time and technically into what he was doing. But even by Jim Lingle's standards, his level of measurement was unbelievable. And Glenn certainly was a committed cattleman, wasn't he, through and through. I heard something, he did a comedy routine. I'd love to have seen that. Do you know anything about that one, Bob?
Yeah, it was Dave Nichols, the gentleman I spoke about, who runs a big operation in Iowa, the biggest seed stock operation in the Midwest. And, I mean, he has a variety of breeds and composites and hybrids. And they would do a routine where one person was the performance person, and one of them was the doubter. And so one of them was, I think, Sam Slick, and I think Glenn was Glenn Klippenhopper or something. And they did this routine, and they did it all around the country. They did it in Canada. They spent 4 weeks touring Australia doing this routine and judging shows and giving seminars and doing this routine. So it became kind of famous until they started to people started to think that was really them. And so they decided they better retire it. But one quick story, at Knollcrest, which is a famous performance pole Hereford operation in Virginia, they were giving it in a sales ring that had water in it, and there was a lightning strike. They had mics, and they put them down. I mean, really, really hurt them. And everybody thought it was part of the routine. And they were about ready to get an ambulance. And then they finally got them back up on some bales of straw, and they finished the routine sitting on bales of straw. But, I mean, I think that was one of their more adventuresome comedy routines where they almost got killed by a lightning strike. But they continued and finished the routine.
Glenn certainly sounds like some cattlemen the world over are characters that like a good time. But he also, I believe, on a more serious note, did he not run for Congress?
Well, he ran for state senate, and he was thinking about running for Congress. And gosh, I wish he would have. We could have used somebody like him in Congress. He was very active in politics, as his son was, and his son spent quite a few years in D.C. And yeah, so he was very active in that, and always had a political interest, that's for sure, and did a lot of behind the scenes stuff, both in his state and nationally for our industry.
And Glen Kirk Farms was dispersed in 1994, and then he got involved then in running the Chianina Association, I think, for a decade maybe.
Yeah, Chianina at that point, there was no full-bloods left. I mean, it had become a composite breed. And it was interesting because I used to pick out the beef classes for the 4-H contest for a couple decades, and actually the keys at that point were smaller than the Angus, these composites they had put together. But it was interesting when he took it over. I said, Glenn, what are you going to do? I mean, because the breed had gotten pretty small. And he said, I don't know, but we're going to go somewhere, even if it's in the wrong direction. So he was fired up and ready to go. But he didn't go in the wrong direction. He did some strategic planning, brought in some really big guns like Harlem Ritchie, and he really grew it and did well. Unfortunately, it's fallen on a little harder time since he left, but he did well by him.
Glenn's still around, isn't he? Although he's retired now with his 2 sons, and I think he takes care of a small herd. It says they're the most trouble-free cows he's ever been around, so you must have the right ones. Well, that's about all we have time for. It's been great discussing Glenn Klippenstein, who certainly does fit into our legendary cattleman role. Bob, really enjoyed your time, and Bill, thank you very much for your input into this podcast. Gentlemen, we look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thanks again.
It's always fun to talk to an historian and a student of the industry, and it's always a great time.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to our Top Lines and Tales podcast. You may like to take a look at our Top Lines and Tales Facebook page as well, where you'll find some photographs to back up this episode, as well as many more photos and discussions on similar topics.